Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at an introduction to a new series on the history of Christianity. The question always comes up, why should we even study about a bunch of dead guys? After all, they were far in the past. And to answer that, I'm going to really begin with the point that their story is the story of Jesus at work. He himself brings up that point. If we go to the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all tell the story about how Jesus had been ministering in Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee, seen pictured on the map, Capernaum. Of course, he'd been raised in Nazareth. But at one point in his ministry, he actually takes his disciples on a trip far to the north to a place called Caesarea Philippi. It was as far north as you could go and still be in the ancient land of Israel. When you come here, there's this big giant outcropping of rock that comes down from Mount Hermon. This was a place where, in Jesus' day, a series of pagan temples had been constructed. It was known as Caesarea Philippi, named after the emperor Caesar. That's the Caesarea part. And there were these pagan temples that had been set up against these grottos, these ancient caves, some of which back then were very deep. Most of them are filled in by now. And the disciples of Jesus had to be wondering, why are we coming here to this place of paganism, a paganism that's on the border of our own land? And Jesus comes here into the district of Caesarea Philippi, where we read that he began asking his disciples, saying, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" Well, they answered, some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah, but still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. There were a host of different ideas, even there in the land among the Jews, as to the identity of Jesus. But he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ." Now, this is written in Greek, so it's translated this way. The word Christ is the Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah. I imagine they might have been having this original conversation in Hebrew. And if that's the case, then Peter said, "You're the Messiah." But then he goes on to say, "The Son of the living God." You see, there were messianic expectations already, but here was a new idea. You're not just the Messiah, the Christ, you're the Son of the living God. And Jesus responds to him, and Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Barjona, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." This was a new revelation. And Jesus goes on to say, "And I say to you that you are Peter." You have to get the play on words here, because the word Peter was actually a nickname. It was the Greek name Petros, which just means the rock, or rocky, we would say. "You are Peter," and evidently this is the nickname that Jesus had already given to Peter. "You are Peter, and upon this rock, this Petra," you say, well, what's the difference between a Petros and a Petra? They're sort of the same term, but a Petra is usually a bit bigger. And remember where this conversation is taking place. It's taking place against this backdrop of this big giant slab of rock that comes down from Mount Hermon, that was the backdrop for these pagan temples. And notice what Jesus says. Jesus says, "I say to you that you're Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." But here's the part that I want you to get. "And the gates of Hades shall not overpower it." Now, they were in a place of paganism having this conversation, a place that the later rabbis would describe. I don't know if this term was being used in Jesus' day. The later rabbis would describe those caves, those grottos, those entrances to those pagan temples as the gates of Hades. It was, in any case, a picture of the false pagan religious system that was evident in not only in the day of Jesus, but in the place where he had brought the disciples. And notice that Jesus says, I'm going to build my church, and the gates of Hades will not be able to overpower it. Now, when you first hear that, you sort of imagine the gates of Hades, hell coming up, trying to overpower this brand new fledgling church that is being formed. But you have to remember that gates do not go out and attack people. A gate just stands there. And really, the picture is of the church bursting through the gates of Hades. And Jesus says the church, the gates of Hades will not be able to withstand the forward momentum and growth of the church. And so we study history, church history, the history of Christianity, because the story of those people is the story of Jesus at work, but also because they are a part of your spiritual heritage. You see, you're connected to something that started way back then, and you have a heritage in Jesus, but also in Christianity and in the church. But thirdly, because you are in a continuing story. It's not done yet. The church is still growing. Christianity is still bursting through the gates of Hades. We have, of course, in our Bibles, an Old Testament, and then, of course, once Jesus came, we have the writings of the apostles, the New Testament, and I actually believe that the written revelation came to an end with that. But there's a sense in which the story continues, so we can describe the story of Christianity since that time as a continuing testament. Someone asked one time, a reporter was interviewing back in the might have been 1970s or 80s, Francis and Edith Schaeffer. Francis Schaeffer was a eminent theologian of the day, somebody who had spoken out on the subject of apologetics, very well known. And this reporter was interviewing both of them, but asked Edith, his wife, who do you think is the most important Christian in the world today? And he was probably feeding her the question, thinking she would say something on the order of, well, of course my husband is. And instead, she remarked, if I actually knew who that was, and I could give you his name, it would probably be somebody that you and I would never have even heard of. And I liked what she had to say there, because the way we view the history of Christianity and the way God views it might be very different. And we have to go into this study understanding it. But we're going to be looking still at the highlights in that story of Christianity. And so here's our timeline. This will be something of our outline. We're going to look, notice there is no year zero, from the year one. And of course, Jesus is crucified right around 30 AD. And that brings forth the ancient church. The ancient church we're going to call from the origins of Christianity to around 500 AD. After that, we're going to see the medieval church, and we will break that into, we'll further subdivide that later, but for right now, we can just call from 500 to 1500, roughly, the medieval church, maybe a few years after that. If you want to get specific, 1517 would be the beginning of the Reformation. And that's going to bring us to that last section, the Reformed Church, beginning with Martin Luther and the Reformation, but continuing all the way up to through the present. And notice we come to 2000 and we go a few years beyond because the story is not over yet. Acts chapter 1, beginning in verse 7, after the resurrection, Jesus gathered his disciples and he said to them, they had actually asked the question, are you going to come yet? Are we there yet? Are you now going to bring the kingdom? And in answer to their question, he says, well, not really. It's not for you to know the times or epochs which the Father has fixed by his own authority, as if to say, that's not the important question. But, verse 8, but you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. And you shall be, and here's the key word there, you shall be my witnesses, both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria, and even to the remotest part of the earth. And so the story begins there in Jerusalem. But we will not have gone too far before it expands outward from Jerusalem all over the known world of that day. And within just a couple of hundred years, we're going to see Christianity, actually within just a few generations, we'll see it expand all throughout the Mediterranean. We'll expand to the east, and some of that story we know about, and some of it we only have hints. There are traditions that tell us that in that first century, the gospel went all the way to India. If you go to India today and go into a church and ask who brought Christianity to India, who was the first to do that, they will point to Thomas, one of the apostles, as being the one that brought the gospel there. Likewise, it's going to follow the Nile upstream all the way down to Ethiopia. A number of years ago, Paula and I had a chance to travel all throughout Egypt, and we came to the Aswan Museum in southern Egypt. And I had not realized it until I got there. There's an entire section of the museum that is dedicated to how Christianity came to the land to the south, to Ethiopia. And very early on, it was one of the early Christian kingdoms where the emperor said, the king of Ethiopia said, I'm going to be a Christian, and all my people are going to be Christians too. And to this day, there's still a church in Ethiopia. Galatians chapter 4, verse 4 says, But when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law. There's something about that time in history. In fact, it's been said that if Jesus had come 50 years before the time that he did, you might never have heard of him. Or 50 years later, Christianity might have come and gone, but it was just at the right time where a whole process of events that God brought forth, because this was not by chance, this was God's doing. He sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, and he did so, yes, to save us, but also to make that message known throughout the world. And we're still proclaiming that message today of the one who came, who was born, who died, who rose again, and who lives even today.